Hello, my name is Nick Capone, and this is Cultural Catholicism, an exploration into the Catholic faith's existence and significance within the culture. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Sam Shephard. Sam is an associate professor of biology and director of agriculture and Catholic environmental stewardship minor at Ave Maria University. He's published over 80 peer-reviewed scientific research articles, and he's a husband and father of 7. Today, we had a really great conversation. We talk about his journey from, I guess you would say, like a nomadic hippie over in the UK to a Catholic academic located in Southwest Florida. We cover how environmental stewardship and Catholicism are intertwined and how they were intertwined as he came into the faith and how that flourished. We covered what we can make of the late Pope Francis's call in his encyclical to take care of the planet. We discussed how to help facilitate sustainable food production. That was very interesting. And what to make of supposed climate change, which is a big one, and how Catholics are to go about that. Finally, we did get to hear a little bit about what he's doing at Ave Maria University to teach young adults and students about how to be better environmental stewards. I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you do too. And let's go. Sam, thank you for being here. I want to give a disclaimer that we are friends. At least I consider us friends.
Very gracious.
But in being friends, I still don't really know where you're from.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard Scotland thrown out there, Britain, Great Britain, or England. I don't know the difference, like most young Americans. And Ireland comes into play somehow too. So, where are you from?
Yeah, I always get asked this because I have what the Americans call a British accent, which is completely meaningless, of course, outside America. Yeah, no, I was conceived in Budapest in Hungary, and my dad was studying the clarinet in the conservatory there. I was born in London, then lived for the first 5 years of my life in the Highlands of Scotland, then 6 years in Sussex, which is a very rural county in the south of England, or was, and then moved back near where my mum's from in Scotland, to the Isle of Skye. Then I spent some time in London and then ended up in Ireland when I was 23. So I've been in Ireland most of the last 25 years or so. So all over the place, really. But there's lots of stories tangled up with those different places. But that's the quick answer.
I can imagine. It's very exotic to Americans. That's a very exotic.
Yeah, Skye wasn't exotic, I think is the answer. When I was little, it was just a pretty gnarly, marginal, rural community in the middle of nowhere. It's become incredibly trendy as an Instagram destination, so it's now filled with Americans and Chinese people taking photographs of themselves in 3 exactly identical locations. Luckily, they don't go off piste at all, so there's still lots of freedom if you want.
That's good. I've also heard you mention, correct me if I'm wrong, that if you had your way, you might just be living in a cabin on a cliffside, surfing.
Yeah, the trouble with that is I tried really hard to do that for quite a long time. When I finished college, I was 20, and I spent a number of years traveling the world and surfing and trying, and I actually got bored. When it came to the point, that was just really insubstantial and unfulfilling, and I realized it wasn't going to be enough. So I say it when I feel like bailing out, but actually, I don't think it's really true. Unless Anna, my wife, would come with me. At this stage, 2 of us would be all right, I think. But yeah, with children and all that sort of thing. Maybe every man has a bit of a tendency to this. We all want to go and hide in the woods, don't we? And shoot bears and live off elks and stuff. But
That's true. Would you, do you have hunting skills? Because if I actually lived out my Yeah, my fantasy, I'd be dead in like a week.
I think probably most of us would. Uh, I would say yes. I don't hunt anymore, but I was brought up. Well, from the age of 9, I remember the first time my friends and we had ferrets for hunting. So you use ferrets, you go and you find a rabbit warren and you put little purse nets, they're called, over the holes, and then you put your ferrets in, and the ferrets chase the rabbits out. And they burst out into these nets and gets tangled up, and then you bash them on the head with a stick. And me and my friend, we were 9. I remember the first time we were out doing this. We did it by ourselves. We'd been in the woods for years, but that was the first time we actually caught something. And then I progressed through guns and rabbits and stuff. There's not a big culture of big game hunting, rifles and so on in Scotland. At least it's rather an elite sport. The peasantry like me just have a shotgun and some rabbits. So, but yeah, I think I'd be all right for a bit.
But you have hunted big game?
No, I never have actually. I would
Okay.
really love to. It's definitely one of my ambitions. Yeah, I know a lot of people who are deeply into it, and I really respect that.
I think, and we can touch on this in a little bit, but I think that that might surprise some people that, you know, you have this love for the environment and yet you also are pro hunting. So we'll get to that in a second, but I have to ask, and this is maybe a bit about your story or your journey, but how did you get from introverted, nature loving surfer who wants to be alone to esteemed academic in Southwest Florida
I think
with
esteemed
a
academic is
with,
massively overstating it. Yeah, it's funny. The introverted thing is undoubtedly true, but I loved traveling by myself, mainly or substantially because I could meet people. And when you're traveling by yourself, whether it be in the mountains in India or on the west of Ireland, you're incredibly accessible. It's much more easy to meet cool new people, and that's how I met lots of my friends and my wife. Um, but it also gives you the option of very easily being solitary for a while, which, as you know, is important to me. So it's about maintaining the balance. Um, so I was going from Skye. I left Skye when I was 17 because I wanted to go to London, basically starting following the hippie trail of my parents. And I was there for 3 years and did my first degree. Then I set off and I went off and wandered around India, and basically in the footsteps of my dad, who was there in 1969. He went overland from England to India. So London, Turkey, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and so on. And he was always full of these flower child stories. So I went and did that for a number of years, Australia and surfing and here and there. And then I ended up in the West. Well, ended up staying in a hostel in the west of England one winter, surfing and hanging out, and still pretty unsure what to do. And I met this guy, a guy called Peter from Ireland, and we were hanging out together surfing. And Easter came round, and he'd obviously been told by his parents that he had to go to mass for Easter. So to make it a bit more fun, he took a bunch of us along for company. It was the first time I didn't know anything about the Catholic Church. I was luckily completely unprejudiced because I had no knowledge whatsoever. So I went to this mass, and I don't really remember much about it. But I think that was the beginning of a conversion experience. So then it turned, about a month or two later, he was going back to Ireland, and he was going to work for a little while on this fishing boat with a family that he'd been telling me about to earn some money so he could go off to Indonesia surfing. So he said, "Do you want to come with me?" So I got myself together. I didn't have any possession. Well, I had a surfboard and a rucksack and a pair of shoes, which I didn't wear. And I went with him back to Ireland, and we hung out for a while. And then headed west to County Clare. And I always remember we got a lift the first bit, then we got another car, then we got a train, and we ended up wandering down this little lane in the evening with the sun setting and the hawthorn flowers flowering along the side. And we arrived at this little house. And just as we arrived in the courtyard at the back, someone looked out of the top window and said, "Hi." And that was Anna, who we're now married 26 years. Um, but then Peter did a bit of work on the boat and off he went. But I stayed behind. Anna's dad gave me £25 a week and a place to sleep on the floor, and I worked in their garden for a while. They had an organic garden and goats and things. And then a spot came up on the fishing boat, and they said, "Do you want to do it?" So I did. And while I was fishing that winter, Anna was actually away for a semester at a different university. So whenever the weather was bad and we couldn't go fishing, I would have my instruction with a local priest down the village. He'd a lovely housekeeper who made great cakes. So we'd eat cakes and talk about this Catholic stuff. And I remember just being entirely happy to accept the Catholic faith as it was presented to me, and that Easter, I was received into the church. So that was the short journey from being a hippie with everything that goes with that to being a Catholic fisherman. And what proceeded from that then, following your question about research, was I got interested in fisheries science and did a PhD, and then started this professional trajectory researching in first fisheries and then environmental science and sustainability science and hunting and indigenous communities and all that sort of thing. And ultimately I wanted to render that and start thinking about it more explicitly within a liberal arts and a Catholic theological perspective. So that brought me to Ave Maria University, where I can collaborate with proper theologians and philosophers.
Hmm.
So here we are.
What a what a proper journey.
Yeah,
Good grief.
it's been fun.
Um, so when Anna went off to school, were you Catholic? Did she return and like you had already become Catholic, or was she a part of
Yeah,
that?
so when I first met her, I remember we had this conversation. So I had been, I think I had been legitimately searching for some. So I was brought up in the Church of Scotland, um, and my parents were really, I think, faithful Christians, but our upbringing had no, well, it had no moral formation with regard to sex and drugs and rock and roll, basically. And so, um, when I arrived, I think I had for a long time been searching for some sort of a more robust mode of living. But then when I arrived in Ireland and was introduced to this Catholic church, which I just encountered briefly in England with my friend Peter, I suddenly felt that I really encountered Jesus for the first time. So without any sort of explicit knowledge-based conversion, I meet these people whose conversion was entirely intellectual. Mine was entirely emotional. So there was Jesus, and I thought, great, this Catholic thing is obviously the way to go. And so I started my RCIA in this very informal manner. And Anna was away. Yeah, she went away very soon after we met because she was actually doing a semester in Franciscan University in America, strangely enough. So I stayed behind, and by the time she got back, I was a Catholic. Yeah, I'd been trained up and I'd received into the church, and of course, my actual catechesis happened on the hoof over the next 20 so years. But yeah, I'd started.
She probably was at Franciscan praying, please Lord, let that man convert her. And then she comes back and she's like a miracle.
Oh yeah, no, I think it was more of a dialogue than that. But I do have to say that I didn't. For to the credit of both of us, I didn't just become a Catholic so I could marry her. But I think we'd already pretty much decided we would get married somehow.
That's
Mm.
incredible. Wow. Um, okay, so you always then had a love for nature, it sounds like,
Hmm.
like naturally, and then that grew into a more academic focus.
Yeah, so we were raised, well, always in very remote places, and also engaged with gardening and growing veggies and hunting and that sort of thing, and foraging to collect seagull eggs and to seaweed off the beach and all this sort of thing for eating. But also, I think both my parents were very conscious of the beauty of nature and very um, deliberate about introducing us to nature. But I think, also have an intuitive concern with the created order. And I remember from a very early age, I was very concerned with obvious degradation of nature as well. I remember when I was 12 or 13 being really aware of, I don't know, things like the rainforests being cut down and pollution in the ocean, and latterly all the sequence of environmental things that have happened since then. And feeling for a long time in my early teenage years incredibly powerless. And I think the way that a lot of young people in the world do now, that there's these global scale issues over which they have almost no influence whatsoever, which inevitably is kind of depressing and disempowering and a bit frightening. So that remained rather shapeless um, for quite a long time. I was involved with organizations, the one organization called Surfers Against Sewage for a while. I was an advocate for that. But ultimately, when I was fishing, that really started to become more concrete, because fishermen are obviously explicitly dependent on the health of the oceans for their income. So for the first time, it wasn't just an abstract teenage environmental uh, crisis. It was more like, okay, now this really matters, because this is now about welfare. It's about how we feed the family. It's about where our income is coming from. And the fishermen are always talking about the problems. There's less fish than there used to be. There's too many people fishing, or too much discarded fishing gear and so on. So when I stopped fishing, I thought, right, at that point, I went and did a master's basically in marine conservation, fisheries, and so on. And then my PhD, which was on catfish in the Mississippi, incidentally. I started to be able to phrase my concern in a much more tangible way of, okay, now I can maybe actually make a difference. It takes so long for a human, doesn't it, to learn enough to actually become useful. We're so completely completely useless when we're young, because we don't have the wisdom or the experience, the skill. But then slowly, slowly I evolved a research path which I felt fulfilled my own interests and capacities, and which was perhaps useful to the conservation sustainability community.
How did, when you came into the faith, how did that bring more order? Because it sounds like, once things got real, you're out there fishing, you're thinking about, providing, and it is connected to the higher things. Like immediately you're thinking of
Yeah.
the welfare of others, and it fit, and there's like a peace in that. And you're like, great, oh, now I can pursue this because it's not chaotic drive. It's ordered towards a good. But how did, when you became Catholic and grew exponentially in your faith, how did that, I guess, did it cause your love for the environment and stewardship to blossom? Pun intended. Did it cause it to to blossom? And then how?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've been thinking about that quite a lot recently. And you're right, the hippie thing is very disintegrative. It felt very, very disintegrated in a sense, in that it's not really grounded in anything. The sex and the drugs and the et cetera, is it feels very lost ultimately. It's not because it's not going anywhere. But yes, exactly as you point out, the fishing was the first time that I was compelled to develop some discipline, because you have to do it. It's strange because lots of fishermen are not well disciplined at all in their personal lives. Some of them are. But with the fishing, you have to be there. So you have to be on the boat at 5 o'clock in the morning. You have to do the work. You have to fulfill your role on the boat, whatever it is. Because if you don't, the whole structure, the whole system doesn't function. And you get there's a lot of social forcing to get it right. That fishermen get also, of necessity, have to be tough. So you get beaten into shape. And I really, really wanted to do it. And I really enjoyed it, a lot of it. So I was willing to submit to this discipline. So this very practical discipline then, I think, started, which was happening in parallel, integrated with my Catholic formation, which was starting to give me hints as to why it might be useful to discipline. I think, first of all, was profoundly useful just in the simple Aristotelian virtue ethic sense that I, for the first time, wanted to strive for excellence in a practical task. I wanted to become really good at this, doing it properly, doing it neatly, tying the ropes properly, hauling the fish properly, gutting the fish properly, dealing with the other men properly. And that started to rightly orient me with regard to these practical virtues, and then associated with the theological virtues. So it was a very blessed time. I think the Lord really gifted me with something I needed, which was both the practical formation and the spiritual formation happening at the same time. So I think by the time Anna, and it was also incredibly providential that Anna wasn't there at that time. So I think by the time she did come back and we started to think about getting married, I was just far enough along that I could make a credible effort to start thinking about how that might look. Yeah. That it wasn't just me anymore. And I was starting to try and do the right thing. Oh, incredibly badly, of course, and totally inadequately. And it takes a long, long time to get back on track. But yeah.
I love God's timing.
Yeah,
It works it all out.
that was pretty amazing.
So, how did you feel then? Like zooming out a bit, because again, a little bit pun intended, but zooming out on a global scale, you have Pope Francis comes along, and given his sort of uh, um, not always direct and clear vocalizations about issues, I think he starts talking about the environment. And honestly, I think some Catholics, I would admit to be guilty to this, of kind of like, oh boy, he's we got a tree hugger, you know. Um, it's become, if you care about the environment, it's become so perverted that even when the Pope talks about it, I think a lot of people have an instinct to like brush it off and be like, that's leftist, that's far leftist, and woke. And it's not. That's sort of what I've heard you kind of fight against, is this bringing balance to this. No, Catholics are called to do kind of what he said. So like um in his encyclical Laudato Si, I mean, he's really calling to this. This is our home. We have to take care of it. So, okay, when that's happening, what were your thoughts? And what were your thoughts on that? Were you happy, like, oh, finally, we have a pope now who's even bringing this issue up? This is serious. And then how can you
Yeah.
interpret, yeah, first that, but then how can you interpret what Francis probably was trying to get at for people who wrote him off?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say that I mean, for me, this was quite a lot later. Laudato Si came out in 2015, by which time I'd been working as a scientist for more than 10 years and this issues. But I think the much more important issue for listeners to this podcast is that Francis wasn't initiating any of this. He was picking up on very strong threads from St. John Paul II and then Benedict XVI, who've been talking about human ecology, for example, for a really long time. And again, they're just completely concordant with the Catholic tradition. We think right back to Genesis. What did God tell us to do? Pretty much straight away, he said, "Hi lads, Adam and Eve, here we are, right? I'm putting you in this garden. I want you to till it and nurture. I want you to care for creation. Your job is to name these animals and basically be in charge of them, participate with me in care for the created order." So this is absolutely central to who we are as people made in the image and likeness of God. It's not a kind of additional part of being a Catholic. It's fundamental to our nature, and it's fundamental to fulfillment of who we are as humans and where we're placed with regard to both God and to the rest of creation. So our job as stewards um, is central to who we are. So I think it's really important to recognize that Pope Francis wasn't initiating something new. He wasn't introducing something new. He was absolutely within the current of the Catholic tradition. Now, I should also say in passing that this incredible politicization of environmental issues is substantially an American problem. It's much less evident in Europe, and in Europe it's much easier to be a faithful Christian and also to be overtly or transparently concerned with looking after what God has made. I mean, it's really unfortunate. I can understand why it is the case here, of course, because it appears that the people who are talking about the environment are also the ones who are talking about abortion and the redefinition of marriage and so on. So it's obvious these things appear to be aligned, but of course they're not. And so what I would really like to do, what I strive to do in my writing and thinking, this is partly why I came to be a professor at Ave Maria University, is to propose and re-propose to Catholics that this is not a left-wing political issue. This is something that we have to do. And in fact, and we need to be bold about it, we need to say, well, we're Catholics, right? And we have a robust, rigorous, intellectually satisfactory understanding of what it is to be human. We have what St. John Paul II called, actually, in this context, an adequate anthropology. We know who we are, what the created order is, who God is. And that is actually going to enable us, that framework of reality is going to enable us to be the best stewards of creation. And we need to be confident about that. We're very confident when we talk about sex and marriage, aren't we? And about the Catholic social teaching and so on. But I think we also need to be boldly saying to those engaged with secular environmentalism that actually, because we have this right anthropology, we really have something to contribute to the environmental conversation. In fact, we were the first ones that were concerned with stewardship, and we're actually the ones that know how to do it properly. So I'm trying, and I find that in my scientific work, I can't go that far, but I can go as far as virtue ethics in the Aristotelian mode. People are willing to listen to that because it doesn't require God, but it does require us to be rightly oriented, like me on the fishing boat and getting my RCIA at the same time. And then with collaborations with other professors here at the university, I can then explicitly engage with Catholic theology and again point out that this is what we're meant to do. And with regard to Pope Francis and his way of talking about these issues, again, I know why people get frustrated or got frustrated with Pope Francis, because sometimes his moral discussions seemed ambiguous. But with regard to the environment, I think these slightly open questions are actually more appropriate, because whenever you're thinking about stewardship of a local ecosystem, for example, a village or a town or a forest, you're always engaging with really, really plural understandings of how to do it. What's important? Are we interested in the lake? Are we interested in the trees? Are we interested in the roads or the buildings or the people or the different uses? You can't just have a prescriptive top-down solution. It doesn't work like that. You're always trying to deal with people's complex emotional engagements with the natural system and trying to navigate through to what is the best thing to do. So throwing out possibilities and discussing them and recognizing the diversity of opinion. In this case, you tend not to be dealing with objective moral issues where there is a single answer from which you have to work. You tend to be dealing with humans within this overarching reality that we do have responsibility for the earth, and we can't avoid that. We're failing in our duty as children of God if we don't take that on.
I just
Sorry, you had a big question. I've tried to hop across the bits of
No,
it.
that was great. Yeah, that was really. I was thinking, just due to my age, that I wasn't, I was thinking, why wouldn't I have been so aware? I mean, I'm also not, as well versed as I would like or should be, sort of in the writings of prior popes. But I grew up with Francis, and I was just thinking the media is really the culprit. And what's the difference? Like American media compared to the rest of the world, American media is so, especially legacy media, has been so manipulative. And so I was thinking, when he did come out and he's talking about support of the environment, just everything here becomes so hyper general immediately. It's hyper generalized. It's like a headline, and then you form an opinion. And so the media is like Pope Francis, like, because again, at that same time, the American political left is going after cows, meat production, animal, like any type of like meat eating is bad, period. And then the Green New Deal, New Green Deal, I think the Green New Deal. I mean, you have all these things. Like,
Yeah.
it's a barrage of manipulation, and it's all clearly not actually to help the environment or the earth.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I just think they just threw him into the mix as like, look, you have to. It was all just, alarmist, even though what he wrote was good. Also, to that point, I think, the carnivore diet is big right now. I think that, I mean, I want sustainable farming, and I want in agriculture, and I want to eat good foods. And I think that's another thing. Europe, at least I know, like in Italy, they don't have such an issue. I mean, even wheat, glyphosate being sprayed on everything, our food's being poisoned. So I organically, naturally want to go to like family owned farms, getting raw milk from family owned farms and going to more controlled circumstances than large scale, slaughterhouses. So it's kind of like interesting, because from a different perspective, I actually think the American culture is starting to shift towards this, not even thinking about if there's any unethical nature to slaughterhouses and large scale farming. But what, in your opinion, how is a Catholic to think about that? And to think about suffering, animal suffering, you know, are humans set apart from animals? Can we do that to them? Can we scale meat consumption?
Well, it's another question with a lot in it. Um, you started with Pope Francis and ended up with can we scale meat production? I think you're right. I think first of all, going back to Francis, I think if we want, as faithful Catholics, to approach environmental issues, we need to start from the ground up. So we can't start with the media. We need to reject the media almost completely, don't we? Because we've no idea what they say, whether it's true, how much of it's true, and how much of an agenda there is. So the only way of dealing with this sort of thing is go back to the primary documents. If you want to know what Pope Francis said, read Laudato Si, read the encyclicals and the apostolic exhortations, and then read the corresponding scientific documents. It's hard work. It's much easier just to hop on one unnamed news channel or the other, depending on which perspective you want to hear, which will be very reassuring and deny you the truth entirely. So there's no point looking at that. So then, having understood from a Catholic theological perspective, following the tradition that yes, indeed, we need to care for the environment. We'll even take a step back. I always say that dealing with the environment isn't, and this is what brought me again to this university, it's not a technical problem. It's not about engineering specific technical solutions to um, mechanical problems. It starts with a right anthropology, back to John Paul II and his adequate anthropology. We first of all have to understand what it is to be human, what the created order is, and how we're meant to relate to those other components of creation and to God. And once we get that right, then everything else actually follows. So we have to understand that humans are made in the image and likeness of God. We're made uniquely with these capacities of intellect and will. And we undoubtedly have a role, which is somehow to draw creation with us and present it to God. And obviously the Mass is an analogy of this in some way. However, simultaneously, we are absolutely part of the created order. Obviously, we're made out of organic matter. We're literally genetically related to lots of other species. We're engaged in very complex food web processes and predatory interactions and so on. So there's this extraordinary, not duality, but bimodal component to being a human. We are an animal. We're a spiritualized animal, or I don't know, an embodied spirit at the same time. So we have to get that right. And obviously, most of society gets that completely wrong. They tend to think of us just as one animal among many, or they have these various ecocentric perspectives where where the ecosystem's completely flat and humans aren't prominent in any way at all. But I think at the same time, there's a danger amongst faithful to imagine that humans are totally set apart, and in some way we're disembodied spiritual beings who have the right to transcend and ignore the rest of the created order. So no, we are part of nature, we're set up, but we're also set apart. But our setting apart is two things we have to realize. One is it's a terrifying responsibility. It's a real responsibility. We have to go to God and say, we looked after what you made. What you created was an expression of yourself. And yes, we took control of it. And the other bit is that we are indeed part of it. So what do we do with that then? Well, then we have to follow from that how it is that we should justly deal with other creatures given this responsibility. And it seems that we can reasonably kill animals in a just and responsible way for our own use, to eat them. And then that follows naturally from our role within the food web, but also from our role as stewards of creation. So it seems to me, and I understand this is not obvious to a lot of environmentalists, but it seems to me entirely reasonable that we can kill things and that it's okay and right to eat meat. And in fact, I've argued publicly in some scientific papers that actually, first of all, there's a lot to this, but actually the kill itself, when we kill an animal and eat it, that evokes for us in an extremely unique way, a completely unique way, the moral weight of eating eating animals. It's impossible to avoid. If you kill something, if you search for it, you find it, you kill it, you hack it up and you eat it, it's impossible to avoid that moral weight of what you're doing. And also, in another way, the kill is a boundary moment in that it helps you to encounter nature in an extraordinary way. And I can talk more about that. But my recent work on stewardship focuses a lot on the importance of this encounter, the fact that if you want to care for creation, you need to know it, and you can only know it by getting out there and participating in it, unmediated by technology or constraints on time. But that encounter is uniquely found in the kill, and the kill is legitimate given our position in the created order.
I think there's also probably famous first example is, the Native Americans of North America using the entire animal, not even just the meat, and they like burn the rest. I think I'm sure there's a massive waste also of the animals that are being grown even to be killed. Um, there's no reverence. Yeah, there's no reverence, and there's no sustainability in mind. It's just like, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, well, that was the other half of your question, of course, is what's the problem with our industrial food systems? And the problem's absolutely extraordinary. And the fundamental one is the fact that we're so separated from the sources of our food. So we eat these small pink lumps of stuff in the supermarket, and we don't know where they came from. We don't even really recognize that we're an animal. And similarly, we eat these vegetables, and they come from huge industrial production facilities. And I was reading a paper only yesterday, which was trying to account for the amount of animals that were killed in soybean production, for example. So you can be a vegan and eat soybeans, but your soybeans killed the soil because they're produced with all sorts of pesticides and herbicides, but also all of the little bugs and creatures that were living amongst the soybeans before they were cut to the ground with a massive like AI-driven remote combine harvester and processed and sent from wherever it is, Wisconsin or wherever soybeans are grown, I don't know, in America, down to where you eat them in Florida. So really, the problem in a way is now not which particular one of the very small number of agricultural commodities we consume in North America. Again, it is much better in Europe. It's the fact they're all tainted by this terrible structure of industrial production and massive large-scale distribution. And you introduce the idea of local raw milk or wanting healthy food. And I see that I agree with you, that there really does seem to be now recently a real interest among not just Catholics, but faithful Christians of all other denominations in restoring a proper order to our food and to the way we live. And I see this with the students of Ave Maria University. They want to have a place, a real place. They want to have some vegetables and some chickens. They want to know where their food's coming from. And I speak to people who've been involved in homesteading in America for the last 25 years, and they say the same thing. They say that homesteading used to be a hippie phenomenon, but the last few years, and especially since COVID, it's become almost an exclusively Christian concern. So there's a really positive move here. Now, and they're very deliberate about how it is that as Catholics we can get from relying on these very fragile economic structures to producing at least some of our own food. And that's a kind of specific discussion perhaps for elsewhere. But yeah, you're right. We actually have a responsibility. We have a responsibility for our bodies, don't we? We can't be eating the crap that's coming from these huge operations. We need to eat proper food.
This all leads, I think, to one last big point, because I know your time's limited, and it's also kind of with Pope Francis, because he called climate change, I believe, a pressing global issue with moral implications.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's, what does that mean? Is climate change real, in your opinion? Is it real? And if so, or if not, either way, what are Catholics to do about it?
Yeah, good. Two bits to that question. The first thing is to think about the climate change, which requires a little bit of a story. So, about 300 million years ago, and for a very, very long time, a lot of the Earth was tropical swamp, and for millions of years, trees were growing, and photosynthesizing. And photosynthesis involves fixing, that's capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, um, and turning it into cellulose, which is carbohydrate basically, in the trunks of the trees. And then these huge tropical forests would slowly, the trees would fall down, they'd sink into the water, and they didn't decompose because there was no oxygen. The decomposition of that carbon-based material requires oxygen. And that material then turned into coal um, under the earth. So hundreds of millions of years of fixing or removing of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere was then being stored as fossil fuels in the ground. And simultaneously, or an overlapping period, there's a huge amount of phytoplankton in the ocean, which also are photosynthesizing, and they fix this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as calcium carbonate in their shells, which then sink to the bottom of the ocean, get buried by sediment, and turns into oil. So for a very, very long time, a huge amount of carbon dioxide was being removed from the atmosphere and stored under the ground. Now, since about 1850, with the Industrial Revolution, over literally, I don't know, it's not even 200 years yet, we've burned a lot of that material and released back into the atmosphere a huge amount of carbon dioxide. So a very long period of sequestration, of fixing, and a very short period of release. So, and we can see this when we look at the atmospheric data. We can see a sudden and incredibly recent and unbelievably marked increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide, which seems entirely logical. Of course, that's going to happen. It was there, it was stored and hidden away, and we've suddenly burnt it and released it. So what that seems to have done, we've been anticipating, since an Irish scientist actually called Tyndall in the 19th century, he anticipated that if we did this, if we suddenly increased atmospheric carbon dioxide, it would induce a kind of greenhouse effect in which it would trap more of the sun's energy and start a process of warming the surface of the earth. So what we've done is very coherent with a rather straightforward theory of how the earth might warm. So I don't think as a kind of a priori and completely theoretical approach to this, we should not be surprised if our human behavior has modified the climate. It follows very naturally from what we've done by this rather coherent sequence of events. So corresponding to that, in my own experience as an ecologist, I've worked with a number of temperature time series which show really significant warming over the last while. So I think, and as a corollary to that, we don't expect, although we have this very clear theoretical understanding of what's likely to happen, we don't expect this to be a completely linear process. So it's not like you release X amount of carbon dioxide and Y happens to the climate, because global climate processes are incredibly complex with all sorts of feedbacks and uncertainties. So I would say, theoretically, it seems incredibly likely to me that climate change would happen. And as far as the data follow, it seems equally evident that it is happening. Okay, so yes, climate change seems to me evident on both those theoretical and empirical modes. I think a legitimate question then is are the moral implications to it? And again, following from what we've been talking about before, our responsibility for care for the earth, if we are modifying ecosystems, whether it be throwing a bottle into our backyard or modifying the global climate system, yes, there are moral implications because we're moral beings and our actions have real transcendent spiritual consequences. I think it is legitimate to ask then, what should we do about it? And I think that's when it becomes much less obvious, because now we are in the realm of engineering solutions to particular environmental problems, and there could be lots of different ways which are the right way of dealing with it. And it may not be that, I don't know, wind turbines or electric cars or this or that proposal from this political party or that is the best way of doing it. And other people, and I thought Jordan Peterson would forgive me for saying this, I think have proposed that actually the cost, the social economic cost of large scale climate mitigation will be too high for a lot of people in the developing world. And in fact, we'd be better focusing on increasing their social economic status, because environmental care follows from getting past your primary need to survive. So the priority perhaps is to help people in poorer countries to advance to a higher level of economic development so they can participate more in environmental protection. And so perhaps that would be a better priority. But these are open questions. What exactly we do, I think, is not as obvious as recognizing that, yes, there's a problem with moral implications.
I appreciate that explanation. That is a good way to go through it. And I'll have to personally think about that. I do have to point out, just so unless I'm insane, that the push for electric as a solution, don't power grids need coal to be fueled? That's a common thing I've heard. Is I don't know if you know that answer, but everybody pushes to like, let's just go all electric, but they have to power the electric grid somehow. And I thought it was through fossil fuels. Is that wrong?
Well, it has been. I mean, you could do it through nuclear as one solution, or through renewable energy. I think when we come to these, when you say grid, of course, I'm reminded immediately of what we were just talking about with regard to industrial agriculture, which is also a grid, right? The idea being you have some centralized production, and the good that you produce, whether it be soybeans or cow meat or energy, is then transmitted through the seamless grid around the country. And I think in a way, the same response is relevant. We say we need to grow our food locally, focus our communities locally. We probably also need to produce our energy locally. Because grids are, partly because the grid's really fragile, it's incredibly vulnerable, but also it requires this massive central production facility. So my question is always, can we produce our energy locally? Can we have micro production, which is renewable? So here at the university in Ave Maria, for example, we have a massive acreage of flat roofs, and we're in Southwest Florida. Why don't we just cover the entire roof with solar panels and become energy independent, rather than relying on oil-produced electricity from somewhere else? Given that someone could
Right.
cut the wire, right? Someone could cut that wire for one reason or another at any time, and then we're absolutely
At least you see that
in
on some
trouble.
homes.
So for me, the fundamental issue is scale.
I was just gonna say that at least
Sorry.
in some of the homes that you do see that in Ave Maria.
Yeah.
And even with Teslas, I think I've seen some owners who will install solar panels, and that directly compensates for the electric that they use to charge their car. So
Yeah, I mean, electric cars have all sorts of problems, particularly the fact they rely on
true.
lithium-ion batteries, which rely on lithium, and lithium is a terribly environmentally harmful element and has all sorts of ethical problems with its production and so on. So again, this is back to what's the right solution, and maybe electric cars aren't the solution. I don't know, but that again, that's a discussion point.
So the last question is, because it's actually nice you zoomed it back in then. So we were global for a bit, you zoomed back into Ave Maria. And so people, myself, I think the question is like, okay, what can I do then? In my little world, what can I do to play my part? And so I think you're free to answer however you'd like, but personally, I'm curious, how do you live that? Both at what's Ave Maria doing to, like, what are you doing to teach children how to, young adults, how to do this? And then what are you doing personally, like in your own home?
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't answer that without coming back to talking about Americans again. The main issue is consumption. Here, people use far too much. It's actually terrifying. So if you go to a cafe in, I don't know, Berlin, you'll get your coffee in a compostable cup, um, probably on a paper plate, or with, I don't know, a knife and fork made out of cellulose, or a proper metal one which gets washed. And so at the end, it all gets composted down, and you've got there on your bicycle, etc., etc. I'm afraid to say that there've been a number of events here where everyone sits down, like a parish dinner. Everyone sits down. Every single one of them gets one of those massive red plastic cups and a plastic plate and plastic knife and fork. And what happens at the end? You've got 100 Catholic families sitting there, and someone goes around with a massive black trash bag, scrapes all of that in, and throws it in the trash. That's a waste of resources. It's made out of oil, and it's never going to biodegrade. Right away, that's a very, very tractable starting point. We could just use proper plates and knives and forks and wash them, or we can use paper ones, which are perfectly adequate for single use. And that same problem propagates to everything else. We have too many clothes. The cars are too big. Down our street, everyone has a lawnmower, right? In the town, I don't know how many lawnmowers there are in Ave Maria, but we don't all need one. And if we're not all duplicating or multiplicating these hard lumps of plastic, then what will happen? We'll have to share them. And if we're sharing our tools and sharing our goods, that generates community immediately. So I've came across a fantastic organization recently, which is called Catholic Guilds. The idea of the Catholic Guilds is you set up local community organizations which share large hardware, for example. They're mainly focused on homesteaders, food production, and harvesting animals and processing them and butchering and so on. But they have, for example, one large trailer or one tractor, or in our case, in Ave Maria, we could have half as many lawnmowers and share them. So I think the easiest and most tractable way is consumption. Less water, less clothes, less gas, less plastic. And that's easy. That's just a mindset change. Doesn't actually make any difference to how you function, except that you might feel better.
What are you doing to teach there, or are you doing? I know there's is there a farm growing or a farm being started at Ave Maria University, or is that still an idea? I've heard talk, but I don't actually know where that's at. Is that you're doing, and is that a way for you to teach these students, like get your hands dirty and
Yeah, that's my personal campaign. Yeah, so Ave Maria University, we've set up a new minor program in agriculture and Catholic environmental stewardship. And the idea is it's a minor because students from across all the different majors will be able to interpret what they're doing within a mode of care for creation. And in the minor, you have to study some ecology and environmental science, you have to do some theology, you have to do a class in entrepreneurship, so people can perhaps start a small business producing some high value product. Um, and been thinking recently, one of the students this semester actually was also studying theology of the body at the same time. And she said that was incredibly transformative for her because it once again grounded environmental concern in an adequate anthropology and understanding what it is to be human in a very fundamental way. But the first stage we've got is that one part of that course, a really important part of this minor, is practical work outside. Um, Partly because of this nature encounter idea, partly because, again, by striving for excellence in practical tasks, you have this opportunity for growing in virtue. And so the first step we've got so far is we have 2 acres in the middle of campus, which is now called Mary's Garden. And that should be, I hope, a permanent place right in the middle of the campus as it develops, where anyone can go, and there'll be places to play and places to study and places to meditate and pray. And we'll have a lot of fruit trees, and we're growing some vegetables. And the students have been there for the last year, driving the tractor around and growing. And so far, we don't have very many people, but the ones we do have are really passionate about it. And I think it's already been transformative for them because they start to glimpse that there's a real logic in this. And you start to see that as you read documents like Laudato Si, but also secular environmental writings, and then you match that up at the same time with this practical work. And yes, indeed, I really hope that we're still going to have a farm. So there's about 10 or 15 acres at the north of the campus where I want to have a kind of collaborative portfolio of different agricultural operations going on. So we're looking for people who can set up a sort of semi-independent operation, and ideally producing high-value, quality Catholic goods. Like we could have someone growing tobacco, making beautiful cigars, or making wonderful wax candles, beeswax candles for the liturgy, and so on. So, yeah, I think it will happen. Please
okay.
God.
Well, we'll pray for that because cigars and maybe even some raw milk would be a good
Well,
thing.
yeah. Some very hot cows. Yeah. Fresh Florida cows. Yeah.
um, to close, it's been a joy covering all of this with you, and even just scratching the surface. There's so much to this, and
Mhm.
you're to Americans. I think you're a rare and needed voice, bridging the gap between the hijacked environmental care discussion and in true Catholic stewardship of our home. Um,
Mhm.
do you have anything upcoming? Anything you want to point people to? I think you have a book that you're you're working on or it's done?
Yeah, that's kind of you. So we're most of the way, I'm collaborating with a theologian here, Adam Van Wart at Ave Maria University, and we're co-writing this book on environmental stewardship, and it's been a lot of fun. So I'm doing the technical, scientific, sustainability science bit, and he's bringing in the Catholic theology and ethics bit, and we're trying to build up this argument that I've touched on today about how it is and why it is we have a responsibility to care for God's creation as a fundamental function of who we are, how we're made, and the role that God's given us. So that's due to be submitted to the publisher in August, which is actually a bit frightening because there's still work to do. But yeah, maybe I can come and talk to you again when it's written.
Okay,
When it
that
comes
sounds
out.
great. That's awesome. Okay, well, I won't keep you any longer. Thanks so much for your time. I look forward to
It's
talking to you
lovely to
again.
talk to you, Nick. Yeah, God bless,
God
man.
bless. Thank you so much for listening, for your time. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. And go to the link in the description below to support this channel. Again, I hope you enjoyed it, and God bless.